Hey everyone, and welcome back to Granite. So I'm very excited today because we get to do the ACT tips and tricks of 2022. It seemed like people generally liked the tips and tricks for 2021, so we're back with some new tips. I've just went through and looked at the year as a whole and reviewed and tried to decide what were going to be the top 10 most useful things for you guys. As usual, right, we're going to go through and we're going to do the ACT English tips, the ACT math tips, the ACT reading tips, and the ACT science tips. And I made one tiny change in that we're going to start with the ACT math tips. We're still going to do all the tips, but we're going to start with the ACT math tips because I've had a lot of questions around those over the year. So I wanted to put a little bit of the focus on those. The other thing to notice is that if you look in the comments for this video, in the description, there is now a free ACT prep course that you can join. We still have the ACT Everything course. It's only $49, and that is everything that you could ever dream of. That's why it's the ACT Everything course. But we also have a little mini free one. All of the practice tests that I'm going to be referencing in today's videos, those are all going to be, they're all going to be in that, or links to those tests, I should say, are all going to be in that group. So you can join it and, download those or print them off or whatever you want to do with them. But let's not waste any more time and jump into our first tip here. We're starting with math. Let's do it. Tip number 1 is, as I said, a math tip, and it's all about imaginary numbers. It is basically that if we get a question like this, here's this example, and we have a definition for I, the imaginary number, and we want to, maybe solve for a bunch of i's. Our calculator has an I button on it, and we can use that button. And I've actually made a full-length video explaining how to do that. So if you want to know how to do that, watch the video. It's linked right above. I'm putting the link right up here. You can look at it. That is going to give you the full rundown on how to use I. But know that for the most part, you can use I just like any other number in your calculator. Just use that the I button on your TI 84, 83, 89, whatever TI you have, and just solve it like you usually would. It'll work just fine, and you don't have to stress about questions like this. Notice it's question 55, right? That's one of the absolute hardest questions on the ACT math section. But if you use your calculator, it'll just do it for you. So that's pretty great. As a little extra bonus question, there is another way we can do this question as well that doesn't involve our calculator, and it's really fast, and it involves factoring. So if anybody knows how to solve this question really well with factoring and really fast, leave a comment below, and I'm going to give a shout out to the person who gets it first, who answers the question first. And I'm also going to give a shout out to the person who answers it best. If you give the best explanation of the group, you'll get a shout out as well. So that's imaginary numbers. Let's go ahead and move to tip number 2. Tip number 2 is all about probability and working with probabilities and combinations. Now, this is a topic that is not covered a ton in schools. The good news is on the ACT, while the problems can sound complicated, the actual math we need to do is ultimately pretty simple. So let's use question 51 here. This is a question from form Z04, and question number 1 before was also from Z04. If you join our free ACT prep group, you can see a link to Z04 and you can look at this question itself, but I'll pull it up here for us. So if we have 12 jurors that are needed for an upcoming trial, the diagram below illustrates a part of the process of jury selection. The 12 jurors will be selected from a jury pool of 60 people. The court records show that only 40% of people who are summoned for jury duty actually appear, and that of those people who appear, 1/3 are excused. So if the same trend continues, how many people should be summoned as close as possible to 60 people in the jury pool? Okay, so if we want to do this, right, and we want to kind of solve this out for ourselves here. We want to think of our probabilities as being on this tree. And what I mean by that is we have summoned, and summoned is broken down into two choices, appeared and not appeared, right? And the court records show that only 40% of people who are summoned will actually appear. So I would want to go right on this little diagram here, and I'm going to write 40%. And remember, if we have percents and we want to actually do math with them, we don't want to write them as a percent because you can't multiply percents and have anything meaningful. We want to always write them in their decimal form. So I'm going to say 40% is 0.4. Remember again, whenever we're doing probabilities, don't write it as percent, write it in its decimal form. So 40% of the people that are summoned will appear, which means 60%, because they always need to add up to 100. All the branches at each level of a tree need to, or each option, whenever you see a split, that split, all the branches, if it's 2 branches, 3 branches, however many branches, they do need to add up to 1 or 100%. So the did not appear branch is 60. So 60% of those summoned will not show up, 40% will. Now, if we move down the tree here to our next branch of the tree, we have excused or not excused. They made it to the jury. Those people are in the jury pool, right? And we know that 1/3 are excused, right? So again, 1/3, we could write it as 1/3, but if we want to put it in decimal form, we would put 0.34. We'll round it 2 decimal places. That should pretty much do the trick. And that means the people that did show up, or the people that made the jury pool, is the remaining part, right? Which is 0.66, because we always want that split to add up to 1. Now, if we want to know the combined percent, the ultimate percent that will show up or in any kind of situation like this, for any kind of conclusion, that the bottom of the tree, right? Of the people that are summoned and appeared and made the jury pool, we go down to the very bottom of the tree here and we multiply all the numbers that are along the path, right? So first, if somebody made it to the jury pool, they were first summoned, and that's 40%. And then the chance that they weren't excused or that they made it to the pool was 0.66%. So we would multiply those together, and we would get, it would be, I don't have a calculator in front of me. Yikes. Let's see if I can do it in my head. It's about 0.25, 0.24-ish. Somebody can check me on a calculator, but it should be about 0.24. Again, we can kind of do round math here because our answers are all pretty spread apart, but I'm going to say 0.24 for now. So that means overall, from the beginning to end, the amount of people that make it to the jury pool are only roughly 25% of people, roughly a quarter of people. Now, we could do this with any path, right? If we want to know what percentage of people are summoned and then are eventually excused, we could do 0.4 times 0.34, and we could see that. That doesn't matter for this question. All we care about is the jury pool here. So we know of the amount that are summoned, roughly 25-ish% ultimately make it. And if we need 60 people, we need 60 people for that pool, and only 25% of the people will make it through the cut. We need more people, right? We need to have more people. So that means if 25% is going to be roughly equal to 60 people, 100%, the total 100% of people we need should be what? And we can set up a little proportion here, right? And say 60 over 0.25 equals something over 1. And we would get that it's about 200. And if we're doing this kind of fuzzy math, it's 240. But we know that, again, I don't have a calculator, so I'm doing it all in my head. But if you had a calculator, we know that it would come out to exactly 225. Again, 240 is fine. It's close enough that we could choose D. I'll be honest, a lot of the times when I'm doing ACT math questions, because there's not a lot of time, I do use this kind of rough estimate math because it's often just faster than punching numbers in if you can kind of just get a feel for it and then go. But ultimately, the answer to this one is D. We see that we need 225 people. And then if we take 40% of those away, and then we take, we keep 40% of those, and then we keep 66%, we'll end up with roughly 60 people that we need for our jury. So that's how we deal with 51. Like I said, that's a hard question, right? It's in the 50s. It's a hard question. So if you feel extra confused about this, please leave a question in the comments and just say, hey, I thought 51 was really hard. Here's what's getting me hung up. Tell me a little more how to do it, and I'll definitely help you. And tip number 3 for math, it is to know your log rules. We have lots of questions like this one, 45, where they say, what is the log of this number? And they give you a number that's unfortunately too big to put into your calculator. If that happens, you need to know log rules. If logs distribute over addition, multiplication, how they spread. And I don't want to just go through and tell you all the log rules right now because some of y'all will know the log rules, some of you won't. But what I did do is I have put a Granite ACT log rules cheat sheet in that free group that I have linked. So just join that and download our log rules cheat sheet. But the tip here, right, is just memorize these. Find some way to memorize them because they're going to test them and they're going to give you numbers that are too big for your calculator. And so you can't use your calculator. And if you don't have the rules memorized, you're not going to know it. And if you do have the rules memorized, it's going to be really pretty easy. Tip number 4 here is an English section tip, and I really like this tip. It drives people crazy, but it's on this test all the time. People get so mad because it's the same rule, it's the same pattern, and I love sharing this with students because once they know the rule, they're like, oh, that is so easy. It's so easy. But once you know the rule, like I said, you get it right every time. And we have a question like this, right? The biologist Karen Workington wanted to determine why the egg clutches react to being shaken and tugged during blah, 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 on and on. This is what we here at Granite like to call a title phrase. It gives a title, some kind of job, right? In this case, biologist, but it could be, I've seen ACTs where they say the engineer or the doctor or whatever. When we have a title and a name, no commas anywhere. Stop using the commas. Sometimes they'll put a the in front of it. The rule still applies. If they say the biologist, Karen Workington, no commas. Because if you remove Karen Workington, you're removing somebody's name, and you cannot remove people's names with appositives. This is a title phrase, so when you have a job and then a title, don't remove it. If you want to know more about this, appositives and title phrases, they are all in the ACT Everything course to really detailed levels. I have videos where I explain this for you can have hours of me explaining, or maybe not hours, but that would be too long, but quite a bit, almost probably about a full hour of me explaining title phrases and appositives. So check that out if you want to know more about how that works. But the rule is, the answer here to 18 is G, no commas. No commas with title phrases. Stop putting the commas in and you'll get it right every time. Tip number 5, another English tip. This one is also really fun. We see here, if we look at our example, we have different punctuation choices. We have a period, and we have a semicolon, and we have a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Now, if you watched ACT Tips and Tricks 2021, you will know, right, that the ACT does not care about the difference between periods and semicolons. So that would mean that the way it is now and the way it is with F is virtually pretty much the same. Now, there's one more part to this trick that I couldn't share last year because the video is already too long, but it's that the ACT considers comma plus a coordinating conjunction to be the same thing as a period and the same thing as a semicolon. It is just the way to join two independent clauses. So that means we can get rid of option G as well. We can get rid of option G, and That means that how it is now, how it is in F, and how it is in G are all just ways that we join independent clauses. And these are all perfectly fine answers to this. We want the one that's not acceptable, which ends up being answer H, because it's a comma, and commas can't join two independent clauses. If you want to know more about identifying independent clauses and dependent clauses and how you actually do that, check out the ACT Everything course, because it details it. The quick way that I'd think of it is, and honestly, just check, I made a video on how to identify independent and dependent clauses. It's linked right here. But basically, independent clause is something that can stand on its own. You can go say it to your friends and they won't be confused. Dependent clause, if you go say it to your friends by itself, they're going to be confused. Like if I said, went to a group of my friends and I said, when I went on a run, they're going to be like, what? What do you mean when you went on a run? What happened? That's a dependent clause. If I say, I went on a run, they're like, okay, yeah, cool. You went on a run. Nice. That's an independent clause. It can stand on its own. Tip number 6 is what I call the vocab trap. And I love this tip because it helps so many students so much. And honestly, down the road, it helps people be better writers as well. But a vocab trap works like this. If we have a question like this, based on the passage, Portillo can best be described as a boss who was mostly something. And people will go through and they'll often get to an answer like D, boisterous and fun, though he had exacting standards. They'll say, I don't know what boisterous means. I know what most of these means. I know what most of these mean. I know what friendly and generous is. I know what kind and caring is. I know what distant and abrasive is, but I don't know what boisterous means. And they'll say, well, if it's the big fancy word I don't know, it must be the right answer. And it's not, unfortunately. The ACT tries to not be a vocab test for a lot of reasons around equity. Having a really vocab-based test is a pretty unfair test. So they try and not make a vocab test. But they know that if they put in big words, sometimes students will kind of say, well, it must be the word I don't know. They won't feel confident in themselves, and they'll choose that, which is not what we want to do. Boisterous is not the word here. If we read the passage, and I'd recommend you just download it and read the passage, we see that Portillo here describes his boss really as just friendly and generous. Those are simple words, friendly, generous, but they are the right answer. So don't get in a trap where just because the words don't look big and fancy, you are concerned because they don't look big and fancy that they're not the right answer. Often, most of the time, a good, simple, descriptive word, if it seems right for the passage, is right. You don't need to choose the fancy vocab trap. Okay, so we are headed to tip number 7 right now, which is to understand the idea of a reading hotspot. So when we are in English class, right, we read books and we get kind of big picture understandings of the book and we make big picture inferences about the book, etc. But on the ACT or SAT for that matter, or any other standardized test you're taking, there is going to be this idea of evidence-based reading. It's that every question needs to have a very, very specific line or grouping of lines that give you the answer. And if we look at this little tool here, the Granite reading heat map that I made, we can see that those answers often cluster together. So what that means is that when you're reading and you find an answer, you want to kind of make a little mark near it because it's very possible that other answers will come from that same area. And you can do a kind of almost a real in-test Granite reading heat map for yourself with the answers so you can find those hot spots. Tip number 8 is a reading tip as well. And it's to know that the reading section always ends with a natural science passage. So natural science passages can be tricky because they are kind of really quite different from the, humanities or social sciences passages that you're going to be reading earlier in the test. They have a lot more technical language and they're a lot more detailed. So some people love them and some people hate them. But if you do hate them and you feel like when you get tired, those details might slip by you, Like that's kind of not as engaging to you as like, if we look at this one, for example, we're looking at desert, dormancy here, and heat resistant seeds, and 200 gallons of water. I'm looking at all these details. If you think you're going to lose those details, I would start with the natural science passage always, because you're going to be a little fresher at the very beginning. And so do that one first, questions 31 through 40 first, and then go to those story-based ones, right? The story-based ones can be a little easier because you get drawn into the story, whereas the natural science is typically less of a story, or it's almost never a story. It's just a lot of details about a science phenomenon. Tip number 9 is a science tip, and I love this because a lot of my students have said that it gave them a super real-world approach to reading graphs, something that they could use, obviously, to do well on the science section, but also to do or to have an easier time reading graphs like in the news and stuff like that. So it is to use what I like to call the Granite graph reading script. It's when you see a graph like this one here, and we have an x-axis and we've got a y-axis. If you use the script, how does x-axis impact y-axis? And you ask yourself that question for every graph and say that that's basically what the graph is going to give me the answer to, you are going to be really well equipped to start moving through that question. So I would do that before I read, or I can say when I did the science section, I did this before I read any of the passage. I would go through and I would say, okay, figure 1, so my x-axis is a month of the year. So I would say, how does the month of the year impact the length of the solar day? Okay, that's figure 1. And then I would say, how does the month of the year impact the difference between solar time and mean time? And I'd go through and I'd say, okay, so somehow the months are doing something with the solar day. And then I'd say, well, I don't know what solar day is. So then I'd go through, right, and I'd go into the passage and I'd see solar day. A solar day is the period between one solar noon and the next. Okay, so it's kind of how long the day is. That now I've got it. So I can say this figure 1 is saying how does the month of the year impact how long my solar day is, how long it is from solar noon to solar noon. And I'd be like, that's weird. It's doing a little wavy thing. And then I have an idea of what's going on in that science passage. Tip number 10 is, of course, my favorite big picture tip. It is to get in a mindfulness practice before the ACT. So many students I've seen don't do as well on this exam, not because they don't know the material, but because they're stressed and they're anxious and they're distracted. And if you get into a mindfulness practice, you're practicing these skills of noticing when your mind wanders off, noticing when you're distracted, noticing when you're anxious, and knowing how to work skillfully with those emotions to kind of let go of them. You're going to be like, much more happier and relaxed, right? Because you can say, I can just let go of that stress. It's fine. I'm just going to let go of it. And I'm going to move into this test confidently. So it's going to make you feel better, but it's also going to make you do better. There's tons of studies that have shown that really high levels of stress actually effectively decrease your capacity to do well academically, and you don't want that. So you don't want your ability to perform academically to be decreased on a test that's all about performing academically. So practice some mindfulness. And if you're saying, well, how do I just practice mindfulness? I don't know how to just get started with that. I have a playlist all for that. It's called Mindfulness for Academic Achievement. It's all about, as you guessed, mindfulness for academic achievement. So here's a link to that playlist. Go check it out, explore. We got stress reduction tips, meditation strategies, everything that you would want to start building up your own mindfulness practice. Thanks so much for joining our ACT Tips and Tricks 2022. I hope that if you like this video, you'll like it, and I hope that you subscribe as well, because I'm putting out videos like this all the time, and if you've subscribed, you'll see when I've got the new ones going. Also, check out this cool new thing that YouTube's doing. They call it polls. I'm leaving polls all the time for y'all so that you can tell me what is going to be most useful for you. So again, go check out the polls, throw your votes in for whatever you think's helpful to you or useful. And I check those polls and I use it to decide what kind of videos to make next. But I can't wait to see all of you in our next video or in that free ACT practice group that I've got linked here. See you all later.